Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Lore. We're continuing with the Adam Curtis review. We require 7.8 thousand. We are back with the same panel as last week. Horus, how are you doing this week, sir?
Good evening. I'm doing all right. Yeah, I'm slaving away at my latest Substack piece. That'll be up in the next couple of days.
And Simon Roberts, welcome back, sir.
Thank you again. As Douglas might say, I'm profoundly engorged to be here.
And good reviews for last week's show. Seems like people enjoyed this particular lineup.
And your incentivization is working, I see.
Yes, there's been 166% average increase on Deepest Lore numbers since Adam Curtis started. And that's an average. In some cases, they've done gangbusters. In other cases, but they've still done better than the 7.8 thousand that I laid down. Before we get going, I should mention that the insane Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called a general election. I have resisted calls to do an emergency stream on this, but apparently it's going to be July the 4th, which is just over 6 weeks away, isn't it? I mean, the Zero Seats campaign is going well. It's kicked into gear. I've been heartened to see that, but I guess I'll give full thoughts on that next Tuesday. Just crazy. I just don't really understand what they're doing at all. Couldn't happen. I mean, I don't know. I've ranted about the Tories enough.
I would just say, just going by polls, which I know we can't really go by, but there's still something like 9 million people still intending to vote for the Tories. So there's a lot of targets out there for anyone who wants to try and get that down.
9 million people are still going to vote for this government. Oh my God.
So say the polls.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Fair enough. I will just remind everybody, do buy my courses at the Academic Agency. Why don't I play a trailer? I like playing a trailer, and then we'll get some plugs off you two, and then we'll get going on part 2 of the Mayfest set. Let's play this one.
Buy Foundations of Writing on the Academic Agency. To write clearly will help you to think clearly. The ability to communicate ideas in lucid prose is foundational to success in many areas, and it is a basic requirement in every walk of life. You will learn the parts of speech and come to understand the core functions of the English language, sentence construction and syntax, punctuation, style, and common mistakes. Once you see how mistakes are made, you will not unsee them. You will know for the rest of your life. Foundations of Writing. Buy it now.
I actually started writing my Shakespeare course earlier on, Simon.
And, fantastic.
Yeah. I then remembered why I haven't been able to do it, because I just, I don't know, it's bringing back a lot of memories for me. But anyway, Simon, anything you would like to plug, sir?
King Arthur Day on Saturday, the 25th of May on Nathan CJ Hood's channel. I'll be with Mr. D and Lady of Shalott talking about King Arthur on film, talking about Excalibur, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and others.
I also recorded a little video for that earlier on as well, which is just Julius
Rick Wakeman.
It's Evela's bit on Arthurian cycle in the Mystery of the Grail. So I should have a
Good.
contribution. I sent it to him earlier. Horace, anything you would like to plug, sir?
Yeah, I'll have a new piece out on Substack in a few days. If anybody wants to sign up. Thanks to everyone who's followed already.
Great. All right. Well, let us make a start then with Mayfair Set Part 2, where, as we discussed last week, it starts to kick into gear, this series. So
influence has declined since the beginning of the century. And the question is this a trend we can reverse?
We are concerned with making money. That is what we are trying to do.
It's been described as the most beautiful terrace house in London.
The abuse of business and financial power.
You lied. We shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war.
Economic activity is best left to the private sector, with market forces being encouraged to operate.
In the 1950s, Britain was dominated by a small group of men, the captains of industry. They were eminent industrialists and bankers who met together at the court of the Bank of England.
I should just mention, by the way, that phrase, the captain of industry, was coined by none other than Thomas Carlyle, who I've done many videos on in the past. If you don't know the work of Carlyle, you should all go back and find Carlyle Day whenever I did that, and there was tons of stuff I did on Carlyle.
The court opens with the traditional reading of names, and the wide experience available to the bank is apparent.
Mr. Cobbold, Mr. Miners, Sir Charles Hambro,
Senior Director, Merchant Banker,
Sir John Henry Williams,
Chairman of Courtholds,
Mr. Cadbury,
Industry, Newspapers,
Lord Kindersley,
Chairman of Rolls-Royce, Merchant Banker,
Mr. Babington Smith,
Banker and Industrialist, Middle East,
Mr. Ely.
I mean, say what you want about these gentlemen, I would take them in a heartbeat over today's ruling class, tell you that much.
No tech bros there.
Sorry, Simon, go on.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, did anyone else snigger at the mention of Courtholds?
Was that the no? That wasn't the one who had Farage. That was Coots,
Farage last summer. Yeah, that was.
It was Coots. Coots.
Sorry. Yes.
Nearly. Courtholds, I think, became part of British Aerospace in the end. So very powerful.
I was way off.
Steel and chemicals.
Men like these were powerful because of the vast industrial empires they controlled. They worked in partnership with the politicians to shape the future of the nation. But what these men did not realize was that within 15 years, their whole world would be destroyed. Their power would be taken away from them, and their factories torn down and sold off.
Already gutted about this. I'm already gutted, friends.
I just would highlight that Curtis is already talking about their power, right? He's talking about these are corporate bosses. Obviously, they're not politicians or civil servants or anything, but he's talking about their power. So this is going to be the theme that a lot of the talking heads, he asks them questions about power.
And the man who began their destruction was a suburban accountant called Jim Slater. To do it, Slater awoke a force that had been dormant since before the war, the stock market. And as he grew powerful, Slater became an ally of politicians. But what neither he nor they realized was that the force he had awoken would overwhelm all of them.
Hey, can I just say something, which is going to be? I know you're still into your kind of Austrian economics and things, Horace. there's one area in which I strongly disagree with Ludwig von Mises, and that is where, in Human Action, he talks about the necessity of the stock market to allocate capital in a capitalist system. I actually think that this is a mistake, and that financialization is an Achilles heel of the system and leads to instability and the sort of thing that we're going to see in this documentary. And I haven't quite figured out what a better allocation system would be, but effectively what I would like to do is to ring fence it from foreign capital, i.e. to bar foreign direct investment through stock market speculation. I don't know what you feel about that, but
I won't argue for now. I think what you've raised there is discussed over the rest of the series, though. So I'll make a few comments as we go along.
All right.
In 1959, the Conservatives, led by Harold Macmillan, prepared for an election. The Tories had been in power for over 8 years, but they were confident they would win yet again. The reason was the economic boom they had created, along with the slogan, "You've never had it so good."
Chancellor, it's really you who've really been the base on which we've done all this, because somehow or another, partly by good luck, but I think by good management, we seem to have suddenly, last few months, got into a position quite different which we've ever had since the war. Somehow or another, we've brought off what I called the other day 2 doubles. We've had for the first time steady cost of living for 18 months.
Going on too, I think that's stability.
I think it will. You go to get the figures and you can see. Well, then the other thing, at the same time, we've had full employment. We've got full employment and steady prices. Well, all I can say is, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Derry, you keep on at that work and it'll be all right.
Pause for a second. Pause.
I thought there'd be a pause there.
Do you think this is a precursor for Sofa Government? Is this where Tone got the idea? A bunch of old chums sitting around, it's sort of ingratiating themselves with each other.
Good job, old chap. You've done a great job. I do think that things can only get better is a better slogan than you've never had it so good. Because things can only get better. You can kind of, regardless of how you're doing, you can kind of read your dreams into that. Whereas if the government is telling you that you've never had it so good, that may also not be true for many people as well.
Especially given that you've never had it so good. It's coming, you're talking about after the war. Rationing's only ended about 5 years before this, and people have basically been living in rubble in a bankrupt country. So it's starting from a very low threshold, is what I'm saying. You've never had it so good. That's
was that Ian MacLeod sitting there? Was he one of them?
Churchill's man again? Yeah, MacLeod. He was the what was he at this point? He was Minister of Labour and National Service, which was still going to about 1960, when, of course, they ended it as again part of his sort of brief to collapse, the empire.
I will say that for whatever bad or good Macmillan did, I've always liked his kind of avuncular and paternalistic manner. It's almost like having Walt Disney as the Prime Minister or something. He's just kind of cozy. And I can imagine him being quite a comforting presence in a way that none of our current leaders are.
And he was also criticised for it as well. I think he was seen as a sort of patrician Edwardian gentleman, and that was sort of feeling a little bit out of sync with the times. Just for a bit of context on this, though, there's an interesting thing about this 1959 election. A bit of a spoiler. Obviously, they won. It was their 3rd election in a row, but their election majority up to that point had been 60 seats, and they went up to 100 seats. Just think what you could do.
with 100 seats,
yeah, or even 80 maybe.
I should mention, by the way, that we were talking about how there are no politicians like that today. In America, I still regularly listen to Richard Spencer for my sins. I know everybody hates him, but
referring to Richard Hanania,
he voted for Biden, and the Biden fans, I mean, it seems absurd now, 4 years later, but back in 2020, almost saw Biden as a kind of calming, avuncular figure. I mean, he's been anything but that. But there is a kind of there's an extent to which that can still work, having this paternalistic older gentleman to calm things down and remind you of the country that you once were, type thing. I don't think it's going to work for Biden again, but
just to mention something, they'll probably say this, but I think this was the election that brought in a load of new, younger Tory MPs who had different ideas from the past. So I read anyway, and it was pretty soon after this that Macmillan made his Winds of Change speech, right, about decolonisation. And the same crop of people who were inclined to support that tended to be pro-common market as well. So Macmillan, shortly after that, winning that election, went on to start getting Britain into the common market. But obviously, Charles de Gaulle didn't want that to happen for a while. But also, I noticed this being an election broadcast that we just saw. You notice they're talking about how the economy's turned up in the last few months. You see, Rishi Sunak just this morning was tweeting about this was, I think it's a direct quote: "Inflation is where it's supposed to be now." It's not. Simply a lie, but they're doing that. I don't know if he was planning to announce the election today or if he just did that on a whim. But yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned about the new crop of politicians coming in, though, because I mean, looking back at the end of this Tory government, which is about to end this year, fingers crossed. David Cameron did the same thing, didn't he? He brought a whole new generation of politicians in 2010. It's kind of funny how that happens because the Tories are consistently the party of radical change in the country, despite their name. Consistently.
There's so many ways in which that's true.
And Horace, do you know about this? Was Macmillan more or less a one nation Tory?
Yeah. 100%. One other little tidbit. I mean, I'm against pretty much everything Macmillan did, but one thing I like about him is that apparently in the First World War, he was fighting on the Western Front, and he got sort of trapped in in a shell crater. It would have been madness to run out. So he waited there for some time, and he happened to have, well, I guess he'd chosen it, but he happened to have, I think it was Homer. I think it's the Iliad in his pocket in the original Greek, and he lay there reading it in a shell crater.
Pretty cool, isn't it? It's pretty cool. And just to answer the guy in the chat, I'm not saying Mises was wrong because I like protectionism. I'm saying that having the stock market allocate the capital basically opens up your country for effectively rape by foreign forces, which is just exactly what happened here, and has happened in every country that has allowed their stock market to be open to the forces of international capital. So what I would do ideally is to basically make some sort of law that, if there is a stock exchange, it has to be tightly controlled so that only people from that country can invest. I would love to stop foreign direct investment. And I would also like to stop money from this country going abroad. And I've explained this in a video before. If you go back to David Ricardo and the theory of comparative advantage or comparative cost, or Mises calls it the law of association, they hold capital and labor constant. That is, they assume that when a factory closes down, the money reallocates within the country, not to go and make a factory over in Mexico or China or some other place. The money is meant to stay in the country. If the money is allowed to fly out of the country, the law of comparative cost breaks down, because that's the assumption. And the same with labor. If you can have unlimited immigration or emigration in other cases, the theory does not hold true anymore. And even Mises says that. So, I think this is a kind of flaw in free market thinking, because they forget that is meant to hold constant. whereas now they talk about the 4 freedoms. You know, the EU talks about free movement of goods, services, capital, and labour, don't they?
And people, yeah.
And free movement of people. And I would hold 2 of those constant. In my view, if you don't hold 2 of them constant, you don't have a nation. You don't have a country. All you have is constant flux, or what Carlyle would call nomadism. So you have to hold certain things in place. And then, if you have the free movement of goods, you can have many benefits from capitalism. But if you allow everything to move, all you've got is constantly changing economic zones, which has been a disaster in my view. So, yeah. Anyway, let's carry on.
The Conservatives had created the boom by following the ideas of the economist Maynard Keynes. He had shown politicians that it was possible to manage an economy by varying the levels of government spending and taxes. It was an idea that suited perfectly the patrician outlook of both the Tory politicians and the captains of industry. It allowed them together to create a stable, predictable Britain under their control.
I think Keynesian economics fitted in extremely well with the patrician attitude of politicians.
In what sense?
Well, they had the feeling of being men of with responsibility and feeling that they had to do something for their fellow men and a responsibility for their for their soldiers, for their tenants, you name it, or the less fortunate ones. They really embraced this policy as a way in which they could, from government, do something to help people.
Pause for a second.
That it was within them.
Go on.
Well, yeah, just for anyone watching who's not sure, like what Simon mentioned a minute ago was Macmillan, a One Nation guy. That's when they say patrician, that's what Simon was referring to. The sort of, it's basically the left of the Tory party. Almost all of them will call themselves Disraelites or admirers of Disraeli, who sort of drew the party to the left. I believe you've done a video about that before, AA. And yeah, it's the left of the party. They also tend to be pro-immigration, you know, pro-welfare state. And in the second, since Churchill, every Tory leader except Thatcher has been one of these, the One Nation, Disraelite, patrician side of the party, except arguably Michael Howard, maybe not, but yeah.
And speaking to that as well, on the cusp of change of the 60s coming up, there was a factoid that sort of jumped out at me that it was from Macmillan's time in the 30s. Apparently he proposed, it says, the creation of a cross-party forum of anti-fascists to create democratic unity, but his ideas were rejected by the leadership of both the Labour and Conservative parties, and he was wary of Enoch Powell.
Did you say he proposed that? Or
he proposed it.
Well, he joined the Focus. The Focus was that cross-party secret war party.
Wow.
Anyway, so, yeah.
So he's an agent of that change that's coming, that liberalisation.
I mean, I will say that in spirit rather than execution, that there is something to be said for this vision that they're talking about, though, which is a kind of predictable pattern whereby, you know, I'm thinking of the old coal mining towns, you know, you're a miner, your father was a miner, his father was a miner, or a factory town up north or something like that, which had these kind of entrenched communities and lines of social roles.
Yes.
You know, it was more hierarchical and it did have respect and things. And they did a fairly decent job of holding that in place for a time. Although we know that a certain amount of it during this period that we're looking at right now was artificial. But I will say that, like, you know, thinking of my mother's generation or people, you know, they didn't have a lot of money or whatever, but they all have extremely fond memories of living in these places. You know, it may have been an illusion, or it may have been like held up by subsidies or losing money or whatever, but people felt like that was home and they felt it was real. And they felt like they knew each other, whereas we have none of those things now. Absolutely none of them. So,
and despite some of this sort of grim black and white footage, actually, these were thriving places in a sense. I mean, that footage of the sort of workers at the docks there streaming out, very much reminded me. It looked like with the town where I come from, Hartlepool in the northeast. You did a film about it a little while back. Those shipyards. I mean, I think there were two or three of them in Hartlepool. I mean, they would employ 2,000 to 3,000 people, hundreds of apprentices that would spill out. I mean, you sort of forget this is a a nowhere northeast town that was still sort of buzzing really up until the kind of end of the 70s. There was a momentum of community and work from the steelworks and from shipbuilding that went on and sustained people. And when this crashed very early in the 60s, as we're going to see, this was devastating. This was people leaving the town. This was people committing suicide, stuff like that.
I also remember something that I read in Joseph Schumpeter, of all people, who is an Austrian. He is an Austrian chap who was an economist, but he is not an Austrian economist, even though he was in Mises's class. He studied with Mises in as a student, but he is not considered part of the Austrian school, if that makes any sense, even though he was Austrian. And he talks about, like, why did capitalism, or what we think of as capitalism in the 19th century and during this period to some extent as well, work in Britain? And why did it take root in Britain? And he argues that the old feudal structures and the old kind of honor codes and things that existed in British society, that capitalism was able to leech off the stability of that structure. And if you think about the structure of one of those northern kind of working towns that you're talking about, or I think of the coal mining towns in Wales, they were essentially feudal. Okay, only you have replaced the feudal lord with a tycoon now. And this was actually Carlyle's point back in the 19th century as well, that you still have basically the same structure, only rather than working on the strip fields, under the lord of the manor, you're now working for the factory owner or the coal mine owner, and you're doing an industrial job instead. But the basic form of it is the same. So what Carlyle was saying is that the captains of industry actually should actually take on the responsibilities and behave more like the old feudal lords to strengthen the social bonds in these communities, because he saw dislocation in his time, and he thought this would be a way of doing it. And these so-called left Tories, certainly Disraeli, who was an admirer of Carlyle's, and various others, they have some notion of this in their mind, and that is what they were trying to maintain. And they did it. They did a decent job of it until it all came crashing down, as we're about to see. But I am, in spirit at least, I'm fairly sympathetic to the basic idea, rather than allowing these towns to be anything. And now you fast forward to today, and the high street is basically vape stores and kebab shops, and people playing on their mobile phones. So anyway, let's carry on.
Power of government to control the economy.
The boom had the required effect, and Macmillan was returned to power. But one of the other effects of pumping this money into the economy was to create a boom on the stock market. The stock market was something that frightened both the politicians and industrialists, because it was unpredictable and threatened their control over the economy. Both lived with the terrible memory of the crash of 1929 and the unemployment it had caused. And as the boom continued to grow and began to excite the public interest, the Bank of England became worried.
Why did the Governor of the Bank of England, I think last November, express disquiet at this boom?
Well, I don't really know what was in the Governor's mind, but it's always slightly dangerous if the stock market moves ahead very fast. People get tempted into it on the belief that it's going to go on going up indefinitely, and sometimes overextend themselves, and then the stock market falls again and people get hurt.
One of the people tempted by the boom was Jim Slater. He was an accountant who worked for Leyland Motors, but he was also fascinated by games and how to predict their outcomes. He decided to try and work out a way of predicting which shares would go up and which would go down.
Oh, thanks very much. Good game.
I, first of all, for about a year, ran my own portfolio, had stunning results, and then I suggested to Nigel Lawson, who was the editor of the Sunday Telegraph at the time, that I could write a column and under the pseudonym of Capitalist. And I did that for 2 years, about 2 years, and the market during that time went up 3.6%, and the portfolio went up 69%. So it proved the point.
Slater's column was a great success. As capitalist, he became famous as someone who understood the workings of the market. And in 1964, Slater formed a company with a young Tory MP called Peter Walker. Slater Walker was an investment company, and as the market continued to boom, Slater became rich, managing other people's money. But as he researched into companies, Slater discovered a hidden secret about many of the captains of industry. They didn't actually own their companies. Over the years, shares had been sold off, and the founding families no longer had a majority shareholding. Their claim to power, he found, was a fiction.
Yes, and this is something that is discussed by James Burnham, severing of ownership and control, managerial revolution. And this is another function of the stock market, because it wrests away that, you know, if you think of the tycoon as a kind of king, you know, Henry Ford or Mr. Cadbury or somebody like that, they were essentially a monarch in the way that Elon Musk is in some respects today. But these mechanisms basically sever all of that. They stop that happening. So I will also mention there's a guy in the chat asking why I don't put the name of the documentary or Curtis's name in the title. That is because when I started doing that right at the start of the series, people didn't know who Adam Curtis was and they weren't clicking on the video, basically. So I change it to what the documentary is about so that people actually click on it, because if I put the Adam Curtis's The Mayfair Set, nobody will watch this. So that is why. Anyway, let's continue.
There was still the feeling that son followed father, families perpetuated themselves in running businesses, and that's the way it was and how it should always be. But in effect, the world, mainly Slater Walker, found that was not so, that basically companies were owned, those that were listed public were owned by shareholders, and in many cases the families only had a very small shareholding, and therefore they were open to change from the outside. And this is what Slater Walker did.
Pause.
Go on, Horace.
Well, so Jim Slater's basically discovered that loads of various families or captains of industry or famous people, they're referred to as being either the owner of these companies or being in control of them. And he's looking into the share ownership, and he's finding that a concerted effort could just take the ownership of these simply by buying up enough shares, or aggressive action at the getting on the board and then being aggressive, or active investor tactics or whatever. They mention later inciting the little voters against the board sometimes, and obviously you see that in the film Wall Street, right? That's what Gordon Gekko does in one scene in that. I can't really see what's illegitimate about this. That basically people were thriving on a fiction. I mean, they weren't in control. They just acted as though they were because everyone else didn't mind the fiction. But this guy saw an opportunity. I think it's fair enough.
I think it's more that Curtis is saying it was somehow forgotten, perhaps in the post-war, Reconstruction period. But there's something I want to say about the way I think about these documentaries. The first three of the Mayfair Set, I think about this sometimes in terms of castes. we have the castes of the warriors and the priests and the merchants. And you see in the first episode very clearly the sort of definition of, capitalism, being altered by the warrior caste. And very much this second one about Slater is very much about the priests, because he has this there's this sort of purist, slightly dead-eyed thing about Slater that's very, he's not into the ostentatious wealth creation and gathering like later we see with Goldsmith and Tiny Roland. There's something about him that's just happy to sit there in his cardie playing chess and being very kind of modest and quiet. But this is this idea that develops of him being the master. He is the kind of the evangel of this new spirit of buccaneering capitalism.
Very interesting indeed.
This is a very fine example of a cork tree. It used to be right on the edge of the road, right at the edge of the property, with the canteen just beside it, and it's in very good nick. It's obviously not been hit by traffic or anything, but presumably it was in danger of being hit by traffic, otherwise they wouldn't have put this big hefty fence around it. And this is a real cork tree. The cork products we made were seals and gaskets of every sort and kind, and we made thousands of those, millions of them. We'd have orders from all over the world, 40 or 50 million at a time, and we'd have machines that were stamping them out all the time. You went into the machine rooms where there'd be 50 machines doing this, knocking out these damn little things.
Cork manufacturing was run by Colonel Coote. The Coote family had founded the company 70 years before. And as the largest local employer, the Colonel always opened Chingford's Fete every year. But Jim Slater had discovered that the Coote family no longer had a majority shareholding, and he decided to try and take the company over.
I went down to see the man who was the chairman. His name was Colonel Coote, and he said to me, his first words, he said, "You can't take this over. This is a family company." And I said, "Well, no," I said, "you're wrong." I said, this is a public company in which your family happens to have an interest."
Slater came in and made his bid across the table. My father wasn't the slightest bit interested. He just told Slater to go to hell. He wasn't interested. Slater was half his age. My father was a military man, or had a military background. And I think he was horrified to think this young man had the audacity to suggest that he might take over cork manufacturing.
He was in a way typical of a large number of people running family companies that have become public but still go on treating them as if they are family businesses. I'm just going to pause for a minute because I want a cup of tea, if I may.
Whereas you were saying what?
Well, people put money up for the shares, don't they? They expect a reward.
Jim Slater then did something that had hardly ever been done in Britain before. He made a hostile takeover. He went behind Colonel Coote's back and secretly began to buy up Cork's shares in the stock market at a very high price.
Can I just say something a second? This is something that is discussed, or the spirit of this, the spirit of what Curtis is getting at here, is something that is discussed by Hilaire Belloc in his book about a certain group. You know which group I'm talking about, right? The title of the book is just that group.
You mean the Plymouth Brethren, you mean?
Well, in that book, it's only a short book, but in that book, Belloc basically says that so much of what happened in Britain and so much of what happens in England in particular is based on a handshake, an honor code. This is just how we do things. And, like, for example, right, once upon a time, let's pretend the three of us were bakers, right? We're all three of us are bakers. And we, I operated in the north of the town, you're in the south, Simon, and Horace is over in the east, okay? there would have been an implicit arrangement between us that if you charge 50p for a loaf, I'll charge 50p, and so will Simon. You know, I'm not going to open up a shop right next to your shop because that's your bit of turf. So that, and all of this was done without any contracts. It was done without any actual formal arrangement in place. It was all done on a handshake. Now, when this other group came in, they were like, "No, fuck it. I'll sell my bread for 30p and undercut you. I'll open my shop right next to yours." You know, they were a lot more ruthless, and they didn't respect the customs, the informal customs of the land. And these things still endure in various hidden ways in this country. For example, let's pretend the three of us are at a pub. Okay, there, even if it's a mess, we all have a mental map of whose turn it is to get the pint, right? I.e., let's say we're all strangers. You know that, oh, he was there first, so he gets his pint first, right? There's an unofficial queue, even if it looks like a ruck, and everybody in Britain understands that, whereas foreigners don't understand that. Or I don't know. Another example would be, you know, paying the bus driver and saying thank you as if he's done you a favor type thing, even though it's his job. And the reason for saying thank you is to not draw attention to the financial transaction that has taken place. Right. So much of British customs was to take the focus away from the money transaction and towards these kind of, I guess Carlyle would call them social bonds. Whereas when this other group came in, they were a lot more ruthless and a lot more kind of, you know, contract based, and a lot more, you know, well, if it doesn't say it in the law, or if there's no piece of paper saying there, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to break your unofficial, informal way of doing it. And this dynamic that Curtis is showing here between, you know, the young upstart and the old family is very similar to that. Very similar. So
I agree with what you say about like, there's a loss when, you know, when outside groups come in with whole new practices, much more ruthless and sort of unscrupulous and so on, like, and that has a horrible effect. Everyone needs to keep up with that to compete and so on. That's horrible. Yeah, I agree. But in this case, I don't have much sympathy with these guys. I think they were deluded. Like they could have understood their own vulnerability of, you know, the vulnerability of their control and so on, or just accepted it and accepted they might get bought out one day, or you know, someone might buy a bigger stake. I don't respect this thing of just sort of insisting that they control the company when just in fact they don't. You know, I think they were stupid.
There's a kind of complacency there. Yes.
Yeah. And it's just kind of habit, but without good reason to carry on with the habit. You know, it's daft.
To the city establishment, it was an outrageous and an ungentlemanly act, but there was nothing they could do to stop him. And as Slater bought the shares, he ruthlessly exposed the illusion of Colonel Coote's power. Coote's position as a local dignitary and the respect he and his family received from the workers all came from the belief that he owned the company. And Slater suddenly showed he didn't.
When the takeover happened, I was walking back to my office from somewhere in the factory, and up until that moment, people would have said, "Good morning, Mr. Andrew. Good morning, Mr. Andrew. How are you, Mr. Andrew? Did you have a nice weekend, Mr. Andrew? What did you do this weekend, Mr. Andrew?" At that day, nobody said anything. Until that day, I thought that everybody is making a fuss of you because they like you. Because they like you as a chap, which is quite important. When you're in that position, you want people to like you as a chap for what you are. And of course, it's a fallacy. Of course they don't. I don't like anybody else in a similar situation.
Why did they like you then?
Because I was my father's son.
I just want to say there's something sort of touchingly naive about that. There's something you can see that's quite wounded in him at some level.
Yeah, gutting for him. Very gutting.
That's sort of what I mean. It suggests that they've been brought up with unrealistic view of the world, right?
Yeah,
and that's a kind of abuse or neglect. I mean, they've been brought up to get hurt like that. It's a big mistake.
Yeah, it's actually a very common thing in family-run businesses as well. Well, as you guys know, I'm a keen observer of the pro wrestling world, and this happened with pretty much every local regional promoter when Vince McMahon came in and fucked them all over. They all went through this, including these realizations that, oh, you don't actually have that respect. It was because you're the boss's son and stuff like that. But anyway,
it's just I was going to say, it's just in a sense, this is the sort of birth of economic short-termism, because everything gets sort of cloaked as fiduciary piety to the shareholders, but of course it sweeps away these social bonds.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not saying anything nice about what follows these guys.
No.
Yeah, it gets worse if anything. Yeah, because exactly as you say, like people, fiduciary piety is a good term, and obviously it becomes law at some point as well. You have to, it's actually mandatory for management to try and make money regardless of other concerns, which is a crazy law.
I guess your ultimate point, Horus, though, is that this had already happened, and they were kind of living on a kind of outdated or illusory notion of what the current arrangements were, when they didn't actually own the company. They were just acting as if they did, right?
Yeah, he's flicking them, and their bones are breaking. They already were weak.
To fund the takeover, Slater had borrowed a great deal of money. To pay it back, he immediately sold off large parts of the land and the factories. They were demolished for property development. Slater had invented a formula which he now repeated. The sales of assets from each takeover were then used to fund the next and bigger one.
Sorry for my language, but this guy's a bastard. He's just fucking over the communities, families, countries. But I guess this is what it is. So
he took over companies that made metal windows, rubberware, car seats, even bedroom slippers. And soon others began to copy him. A group of takeover men grew up who began to break up the old paternalist world that dominated British industry.
The comfortable scene that these people broke in on was too comfortable, was old-fashioned, was uncompetitive, was cartelized and convenient for the people who were running it. Needed breaking up, was breaking up. It needed something vulgar like market forces breaking into it.
Why, though? This is my question. Why is there the belief that these old things that actually were worked and were fairly pleasant for people, why did it have to be broken and smashed? This is what is the mindset here?
I mean, if Slater profited by doing this, then the shares were rated very lowly, right? Before, I mean, I know they said he bought a lot of the Cork company at a high price, but he must have eventually released more value than he paid for. Otherwise, he wouldn't have kept doing this. Which means that essentially they were being valued very low, probably essentially from bad governance, right? Which is no good for
something he said, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's an opportunity there. I would go for it if I saw it, if I had the means to raise the money and the aggression to do it. I don't think I think these people sort of showed their necks to him.
Yeah, he did say that in an interview towards the end of his life. There's an interesting article that The Independent did with an interview with him. I mean, he wasn't a particularly nice man, although there's some charming bits of footage later on with him. But there's a bit where the interviewer raises Slater Walker, and he says, "I'm not particularly proud of that. It failed after all, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I'm neutral. I don't deny asset stripping, though the phrase is used as a smear, usually by spineless people who cannot manage their companies. If a firm has its assets stripped, it means that they've not been properly used.
That's a much more succinct way of what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Let them. I mean, see, there's a part of me just thinks, okay, it was an illusion. They were making whatever it was they were making in those machines, and sending them around the world, possibly not making that much money, but it kind of existed and it was fine. Whereas they basically just smashed it all down for what? Like, you know what I mean?
And there is an interesting cultural reaction to this in the 60s. I mean, the sort of the Monty Python thing, they were always kind of, making fun of accountants, which is what Slater is. And you wonder if some of that is a kind of slightly deflected annoyance because Slater Walker, I think, I mean, in Monty Python, I remember in the books, they would have like parody names like Slater Gumby or, Slater Paradine, which was a reference to David Frost, whose middle name is Paradine. And it was this sense of it being used as this, the unacceptable face of capitalism, this kind of, violence that was shaking this reasonably pleasant world up. And you always got the sense that the Pythons maybe was sort of, especially like people like John Cleese, he reacted very much against this sort of thing, this sort of disruption.
We will have to do something on Python when the Curtis series is over. We will have to do something on Python and their simultaneous role of memorializing and also destroying that world, because I do think that they are responsible for making fun of the old establishment.
Yeah, there's a sort of they're having a sort of dawning realization that these kind of these new capitalists are the sort of impersonal, non-romantic kind of Aravisti. I mean, they're displacing a sort of liberal idealism.
See, I've always kind of loved this world, the kind of world that they're destroying here. I associate it with like, the Mr. Mem books, and maybe just like Arthur Lowe in general, Captain Mannering, and
your man in
I don't know,
Bedknobs and Broomsticks as well.
Yeah, it just looked like a kind of fairly cozy little time, and what replaced it was not cozy. What do the kids say these days? Lindy. I don't know if that word applies to this, but I've always kind of liked that. It just seemed like a little moment, a little oasis of stability that had existed there for like 20 years or something.
And it's the world that's kept going in the Claremont Club, whereas they're tearing it down on the outside.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing is often caused to happen by rather vulgar people. It's not the worse for that. But of course, there were some real spivs of different kinds among them. Of course there were.
Was Slater a spiv?
Yes, I think he was.
This is the great room, or the saloon, as they called it in the 18th century.
Yeah, I have always thought that a spiv was like a guy in a long green jacket, kind of selling
nylons,
combs or something.
That's a spiv as well. Yeah, it's supposed to be, isn't it? Supposed to be like a market, a potentially shady market hawker sort of thing.
Yeah, with a thin moustache. Do you ever remember a Harry Hill's TV show? The character Finsbury Park. He was a spiv, I think.
Or there's a guy in Only Fools and Horses, isn't there as well? He's got like slick back hair, and I can't remember his name, but he's got a very thin moustache like that.
Or was there a guy called Arthur Daly?
In Minder.
he was a spiv, wasn't he?
To an extent there was, and it's sort of, I mean, they're using spiv here in this pejorative way. Because, I mean, I suppose obviously people have memories of the war and the spivs as being these kind of, ducking and diving barra boys. But there's also, I think, this thing of this time, I think people forget that the sort of, I remember people saying this back in the sort of, 70s and 80s, that the thing to sort of really insult people was saying they were nouveau riche. You know, there was quite a sort
Yeah.
of not exactly a snobbery, but actually probably an anger or a frustration with it as well, because it was these vulgar people, as the journalist is talking about, and Goldsmith reiterates this later. It's the people with the vitality and this gauche energy that actually promote this inflection.
I just sorry, I just want to add at this point, if anyone's sort of mystified why I'm taking the side of the sort of corporate raider guys, I well recognise, what has come about since, and like how cold and ruthless these guys are. But it's informed by what happened in the 80s, right? Because when Thatcher got in, there was a reaction against her from the left of the party, which was people like James Pryor, Ian Gilmore, and like all these the aristocratic types, and I associate with these guys the captains of industry, and they tried to stop Thatcher being a thing, and unfortunately for them, a lot of the people supported her and wanted some breaking up, some dissolution of the post-war consensus because they found it very constrictive. A lot of working class people did, and these guys have nothing but contempt for all that. Now I understand democracy brings its own problems, and demotic politics brings its own problems as well. And Thatcher didn't exactly leave a very good legacy. But what these guys were trying to carry on with and trying to stop her doing, I think, was even worse. The carrying on of the post-war consensus through the 80s, if it was even possible, would have been a terrible thing. Inflation was becoming an almost unbearable problem for one thing, and there's a lot of other problems as well. Britain in general was just declining compared to everyone else. Even France. So it all has to be considered in that context, I think. There was a sort of a class war going on.
Yeah.
And I don't have a lot of sympathy with the upper class in this matter or many others.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of the realities of it. It's true. Many working class people did vote for Thatcher. And I'm just even remembering when I was a kid in the 80s, it was Dallas and Dynasty and, credit cards and, one in a house with a swimming pool, stuff like that. So, all of that stuff did exist as well. It's kind of it's an interesting thing to think. I don't have the answer for it because clearly the post-war consensus did not work in the end.
No. And what triggered me to think like that was when Thatcher died, 11 years ago, there was a documentary that came out. It had obviously been prepared. It came out like the day after she died or something. But it's Martin Durkin, not someone I'm particularly a fan of. He's from Spiked and all that crew. But he just made that case that I basically laid out, that it was, think of it in terms of class. And there are reasons to be sympathetic to her. It's not all, it's not that she was just this sort of alien element that came in and just sort of threw everything about and was kind of chaos. There was a reason for it. There was some popular desire for it as well. But it's a whole big mess. As I say, it's not like she did good. It's that what she disrupted probably had to die anyway.
Yeah. At the same time, I'm sympathetic to what AA is saying about the sort of relative social contentment that gets fractured by this. And thinking back to the sort of the stats on it, I read that working men's wages went up about 20% in the 8 years between the Conservatives taking over in 1951 to the 1959 election.
I also think, I'm just thinking back to people in my own family and people I've known and so on. I think there's a certain extent of people not knowing what they had until it was gone as well. You don't appreciate things until they're truly, till they've been destroyed. And then you look back and you think, oh, maybe we did actually have it good there. And I think that may be the arc that many people kind of lived through and went, certainly my mother's generation who grew up in one of those towns in the 50s, did the whole thing, the Thatcher thing, got excited by it, satellite TV, you name it, whatever. And then suddenly woke up one day and was like, where's the country gone? And I think a lot of people have had that kind of difficult realization at some point. but also horror. Like the brute reality is that by the late 70s, it was fucking done anyway. So, yeah. Anyway, let's carry on.
Room built with an extravagant design. All the panels on the ceiling were painted by William Kent himself, and are the love life of the gods of ancient Greece.
The social centre for the takeover men was the Claremont Club, a gambling club in Berkeley Square in Mayfair. It was run by a right-wing aristocrat, John Aspinall. He was a ferocious professional gambler, and those he admired and let into his club were people he described as risk-takers.
Didn't we see this club last week?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was the same club, right? We've come back. Yeah.
Some people actually seek risk, and they put themselves at risk voluntarily. And I think this is a spirit that is to be admired. I think it's the spirit that built the prosperity that everybody in this country is enjoying today. Was created by adventurers, by merchant adventurers, by pirates, if you like Morgan and Drake.
£200 for £200. Cards, please. 8 cards. 6. Could I have a bet of £50, please?
The Claremont was considered to be fast, in one word. Fast, gambling, up all night.
Is she a troon?
No.
She's got a very deep voice, isn't she?
Yeah, she's one of those home counties girls who was a journalist.
My gosh, she's got a deep voice.
Kept odd hours, didn't do a regular 9 to 5 and yet still managed to make millions, which slightly annoyed some people.
No, wait.
Nouveau riche businessmen were forming a new set in society which had it was like a separate court, a separate set, which flourished on its own and attracted fairly fast girls, of course, who were mostly after the money, the rich men, the diamond necklaces and all that.
Someone's telling me that you won £1,000 playing this game.
Well, I have done, but not for myself, for somebody else, Because I can't afford to play with that sort of money.
Well, how does playing with other people's money compare with playing with your own?
Well, in a way, it's more exciting because you can imagine it's your own and you can do many more things that you wouldn't dare do with your own money. If a bank comes up for £100 and you really feel that it's going to win with your own money, you wouldn't dream of doing it because you can't afford to lose £100. At least I can't. With somebody else's, you don't worry.
How old are you?
Me? I'm 20.
Pause.
The other dominant member of the...
I wonder if that's her real accent. I wonder if she's actually, Brenda from Liverpool or something, and just,
she's managed to affect it. You think?
Do you know, like you see the old footage of Mick Jagger in the '60s, and he talks with this kind of, public school voice, which he gradually drops.
Interesting, yeah. Do you know that I was watching something earlier on? I've always thought that Beth Rigby, the Sky journalist, affects her slightly, kind of, she's got that kind of common affectation.
Yeah, like Tone with his glottal stop estuarine.
Yeah, she kind of drops her T's and things like that.
Yeah.
I also noticed that in that casino there was a gentleman who looked a lot like Daniel Craig. Did you see him?
Yeah, spitting image.
The Claremont set was James Goldsmith. He had briefly been famous in the 50s when he had eloped with a Bolivian heiress called Isabel Patino. She later died in childbirth. Goldsmith now became a close friend of Jim Slater's.
Jimmy Goldsmith and I were great friends. We used to dine together and play backgammon together very frequently. He was, I think it's fair to say this, better educated, more cultured, from a more cultured background, and more of a bon vivant, really, as well. But in terms of business, we were very similar. We were definitely, for want of a better word, hungry.
Slim. A nice way of saying that, just like me, Goldsmith was an absolute bastard.
And fit.
Goldsmith specialised in targeting food companies. His first success was Slimsear, the makers of a slimming bread. He immediately sold off many of its assets.
Keep you slim and fit.
But he immediately got rid of Trendy and he got the whole thing for nothing. So it was a very good deal. And then it was one of many. And I remember at one time, he had Slimsear bread, Prosear bread, he had Elizabeth Shaw chocolates, he had Carson's chocolates, He had that excellent water biscuits. I still use them. What are they from? Cars water biscuits, Jacob's water biscuits, Holland's toffee, and Singleton and Cole.
I will say, Horace, that there is a side of me, and I've told you this before as well, Simon, as well. There's a side of me that does appreciate there is a kind of masculine side to the all-out capitalist bastard. Like I'm thinking of There Will Be Blood. I drink your milkshake, or what was that film? Naked, with that kind of insane
Jeremy,
that insane kind of landlord. I mean, there is that side of it, and I can, like, from a certain point of view, I can appreciate that. But I also think that they are like, this is some dark shit that we're watching here as well.
It's got a really strong aversion to like vagueness and unthinking habitual behaviour, So when I see people just acting as though they're in charge of something when actually they're not, that just seems silly to me. Seems like they're asking for trouble, But I'd say again, I don't particularly like what followed.
One of the things I like about the Mayfair set, well, I've always enjoyed it as a documentary, is it's this enjoyable sort of sense of empire building. It always reminds me, I was never a big computer games guy, but one of the games I really loved, I used to play back in university, was Sid Meier's Pirates.
I played that a lot as well.
I just love that thing of just ruthlessly, sacking places, sinking ships, and taking people's money. But it's just fun. Just build up wealth really quickly.
Dance with the governor's daughter. Do you remember that?
Being a reasonably nice guy, though, you did it in computer game form, not to real people. So
absolutely, I distance myself from the real world of violence.
Snuff, I never used that. But I mean, he had so many products you see all around you, and he had Chewits. And when he bought Chewits, he said, "Do you know, Aspers, 40 million Chewits a week are consumed in this country." And I said, "What is a Chewit?"
Chewits, even chewier than a 15-story block of flats.
I think Goldsmith wanted power. I think that Goldsmith was, as a personality, by far the most powerful of them all. A formidable enemy, a ruthless combatant. There is a story of Goldsmith at school which I'd like to bring into this because I think it's to do with the character of the man. He was a turbulent schoolboy, to put it mildly, didn't get on with his housemaster, but when the time came for him to leave early, he turned up in the housemaster's study and said, "I know we haven't always got on, but I don't want to part on bad terms. I've got a present for you. It's the complete recording of The Marriage of Figaro, which in those days was on Fragile 78 Records." Housemaster quite melted at this. The parcel, and Goldsmith dropped it. A combative man, a man who didn't believe that you shouldn't kick a fellow when he was down.
Sadistic.
That is just...
To the establishment, the Claremont set were a group of destructive gamblers. They were tearing up British industry and fueling a dangerous boom in the stock market. The journalist Paul Johnson wrote, "They are squirming social scum, typical of the rottenness that is poisoning British society." But to one group in Britain, they were heroes. These were the growing suburban middle classes who were now investing heavily in the booming stock market, and in turn giving Slater and the others their growing power. To them, Jim Slater was the master of the market.
Pause a second.
People like...
Go on.
You notice he said he referred to the middle class's growing power. What's he referring to? Middle class is not especially thriving, let alone...
I mean, I guess he's talking about them buying shares or
it's not power.
Investing their savings or whatever.
Curtis's weird use of the word power, confusing it with money. It's a thing of his.
I mean, I mean, if you think about what happened though, from this point to the Blair Revolution, really was a kind of middle class takeover of the country from the, from the sorts of people that we're seeing in this documentary. A lot of that set were kind of shunted aside by the Blair and Thatcher. I mean, Thatcher was middle class too. Don't forget.
I would say much of what's been done by the government since Blair, and the Tories as well, has been done against the middle class as well. It's a certain section of the middle class that ascended at that time, and it's a very, very extremely left wing, anti-native, anti-traditional part of the middle class. But Curtis sweepingly sort of talks as though they're just like the whole middle class has taken over. That's so crude. That's nonsense.
Slater awakened the power of the stock market. He created tremendous excitement, sent share prices roaring, focused attention, national attention on the stock market. It was the story of the day.
What power did he have personally?
He had immense power in that, with a word, he could move markets up or down. It was quite a frightening power, probably frightening to him too, I would have thought. He had to be very careful about what he said.
So this is just sort of an example of how Curtis poses that question. The guy obviously finds it a bit strange to talk in those terms, but he tries to answer in those terms anyway because that's what he's been asked. And he comes out with this weird thing like Jim Slater had immense, but no, he didn't. He ran an investment fund that made loads of money for a while and then I think went to zero in the end. Like he didn't take over anything. He didn't make any laws. He didn't, make any treaties. It's not power. It's absurd to call it power.
I mean, do you think Curtis might mean it in so much as it affects real people's lives? It has a real world impact, even though he's not in formal power making laws or legislation or whatever. That every time he does this, it is somebody's real job or a real building that gets knocked over or something like that.
Like business is of great consequence for sure, but it's like, I mean, if you widen the definition of power to everything that affects people or everything that affects people seriously or whatever, then it's just far too broad a definition. Power to me is the power to imprison, kill, order, like to tell people what to do and to force them to do it. That's really what power means, as far as I'm concerned.
I think maybe it's Curtis alluding to the sort of power of stories. That Slater is this avatar of change who tells this story. There's an interesting quote in that interview with Slater I picked out actually, because towards the end of his life he started writing children's books, weirdly, and there's a quote in there. He's talking about how he enjoys writing them, and he says, "Look, I could tell you a story now, making it up as I go along. I have a gift for narrative. I'm just not good at descriptions." It sounds like he's the sort of guy who he doesn't think of the consequences. He thinks of taking you on the journey, Slater. This is this messiah figure, but he dumps you with the cold, brutality of the outcome at the end, where you see, well, he's wrecked industry.
Do his children's stories have unhappy endings?
They're all about monsters of some kind, it seems, from looking at them. Cool. I mean, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate a bit for Curtis here. His basic thesis in this whole documentary is the primacy of business over political power, over conventional political power, and that by the end of this process, the money men basically had it over the government, rather than vice versa.
I think by the end of this series, or maybe by the end of this episode, at least by the end of the series, we'll see that that's not a sound conclusion. That's not what happened. Politicians have not lost their power. Like Curtis loves to imagine that they have. Or I think he says in The Power of Nightmares or another one, he says they've given away all their power. That's almost a direct quote. They've given away all their power, he says. That's just nonsense. Like Sam Mellier's in jail, right? They haven't. Politicians are in charge, and if they want to strike people down, they do. We'll see. Well, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's not seen it. In the next episode, the corporate raiders, when they are deemed to be a threat, they just get taken down. That's what happened to Michael Milken. Well, I don't want to spoil it for people, but the politicians come out on top.
His bigger picture, though, is about how these, Goethe in general, about how these utopias, these fashions, that sweep across cultures. I mean, in this one, it's kind of like he sort of talks about this later with the trap. It's like the game theoretic mindset, finding the shortest moral route to your goal. And that sort of ends up later on with like marketization in social reform, to appeal to people's kind of, self-interested incentives. It's that he's at least saying that, it may not achieve those particular ends, but it's that disruptive force which sort of, makes history then lurch on to the next, iteration of whatever the consensus is.
But he knew that if he bought a share, the share will go up. And that's a pretty good way of printing money.
But Jim Slater was about to stop being a despised outsider. Politicians were going to turn to him for help and make him an influential force in British politics.
There's one basic fact. Labour has a clear majority. We have a Labour government.
In 1964, a Labour government had been elected. They came to power promising to create a modern, prosperous Britain. But almost immediately they were faced with a crisis. The boom that the Tories had begun 5 years before had gone out of control. British industry simply couldn't cope with the demand created by the boom. The new government faced growing inflation and a balance of payments crisis. They had to cancel many of their election promises and cut spending.
I would appeal to people to give the Prime Minister a hearing and not these exhibitionists who follow him from hall to hall.
But our old friends return to the purpose of this meeting. Everything in our program has been costed and is included within the program of our national plan, within our tightly controlled and rigidly expended government expenditure program for the next 5 years. Now, we have some very difficult years ahead of us. I hope no one is going to deny that now.
The fundamental problem, the politicians believed, was productivity. If they could make industry more efficient, the economy would grow and Britain would become rich again. What was needed was a quick way to reorganize industry. At this point, Jim Slater emerged as a public figure. He portrayed himself as a new kind of industrial manager. Unlike the old captains of industry, he was not concerned with the national interest. He was only concerned with making a profit.
You are, in a sense, a new breed of person in British industry, aren't you? Now, you don't deal with any one thing other than money, really. I mean,
that is, in a sense, our product.
How do you mean?
Well, we are concerned with making money. That is what we are trying to do. And I regard my prime job, if I can put it that way, as a responsibility to my shareholders to provide for them an increasing return per annum on their capital employed. And this, to my mind, is what it's all about.
What Slater argued was that he was using the stock market as a tool to reshape industry. He sold off any part of a company that didn't make a healthy profit. What remained automatically became more efficient. And he pointed to his phenomenal growth in profits to prove this. What Slater seemed to have invented was a way of increasing productivity without having to invest any money. He was no longer a wrecker of industry, he was its saviour.
And Slater had been seen as a pirate, truth to tell, a trampler of the established order. But of course by this time perhaps it was a good idea to trample the established order, make it leaner and fitter and all the sort of jargon that people put round at such a time. And here also were people who were regarded, and Slater is the classic example, as wizards. They looked like agents of industrial reconstruction. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the government at the time, the Wilson government, a Labour government, had an industrial reorganisation corporation going on at the time, actively backing takeovers, having preferred favourites. It's also worth remembering that the minister in charge was Tony Benn.
Oh God.
So the government's already got its own board for making like takeovers and mergers happen. Like generally, they're trying to run the economy in a corporatist manner, right? They want a smaller number of bigger firms, which have probably written agreements with the government and the biggest trade unions, right? So like corporatism, you know, post-war consensus or corporatism, dirigisme, and so what might be referred to as like the market forces taking over is also organised by the state or by the Labour government, which I think is quite significant. This is still part of the post-war consensus. I just wanted to pick up on another thing as well. Oh, sorry.
Were the Wilson, just so I understand what's happening here, were the Wilson government actually trying to get things off the government books by selling them off at this point as well, or not really?
I'm not entirely sure, but I think that they're trying to manage the whole economy, including the private economy. And this, you know, when in a corporatist system, if a big company is failing or potentially failing, that's a problem for the whole system. It's one of the absurdities of it, I think. But in which case the government, I mean, you see this even in so-called much more free market economies as well. Famous example being in the 90s, I think it was about 97, there's a firm called Long Term Capital Management. That was a fund with a very intellectual board of advisors on it, and they thought they had a new way of making money. Anyway, after about a year or so of doing brilliantly, it suddenly did terribly and began to fail and was about to fail. And the government arranged a takeover. They didn't put out any public money themselves, but they arranged a takeover by a consortium of private interests. It's because they were considered so, you know, too big to fail is the term now, right? Systemically important. So that operates even like governments tend to behave that way even in a much more free market economy. But in this time, it was like, a lot of firms were systemically important in all sorts of sectors, not just financial.
But what it seems like this guy Slater is doing is he's taken over. You know, he'll facilitate a merger or an acquisition or whatever, take over a company, see which bits aren't making money, and just shut them down.
Yeah, sell off the assets usually. Like, if you've got like 3 or 4 parts to your business and one of them is making losses all the time, you'll identify what profitable assets are in that section, sell them, or sometimes that entails selling off all the assets of the company and just breaking the whole thing up. But so you acquire the company and then you, as quickly as possible, cease to have any of the unprofitable parts of it, whatever that entails.
The Labour government copied Slater's methods. Under Tony Benn's guidance, they masterminded massive takeovers and mergers in British industry. Old companies were forced together to make new conglomerates. Upper Clyde Shipbuilders was created on Clydeside, and in the process, as with Slater's takeovers, thousands of workers were sacked.
For the people, some people here at this meeting, there will be an opportunity of a transfer. For others, there will not. And to be
so just so I understand this right, Tony Benn is doing
the hatchet man.
Tony Benn is doing a government facsimile or simulacra of what Slater is doing in the private realm, but he's doing it through government forced mergers and enclosures.
And laying off thousands of people at a time.
Yeah. This is the thing that I sort of didn't quite understand for a while. I did a little bit of reading about Ben because I don't know too much about him, and Horace will know a lot more. But this thing when he went to Upper Clyde Shipyards, it seems the top line he was arguing for was, quote, a labour movement to intensify its discussion about industrial democracy. Apparently, Ben was regarded as what's called a syndicalist. I don't really know what that is, but I've managed to gather that it's about the takeover of the means of production more by industrial action than by share acquisition. So I think he was behind something called the Institute for Workers' Control.
Yeah, syndic means union, like trade union.
Right, but he's essentially doing the same thing through a different mechanism. Interesting.
Be unemployed is bad enough at any time, but it's a great deal worse, in my opinion, at a time like the present, when people not only feel that in losing their jobs, they are losing their incomes, but it is, of course, the feeling of hopelessness that comes with
It wasn't just shipbuilding. British Leyland was formed by the forced merger of old car companies, and AEI was created out of the electrical industry.
I sorry for pausing again, but I've got all these books on exporting the American model, super imperialism, about how the American way of doing things was imposed on Europe after the war. All of this that we're watching now is considered as part of that process, because one of the factors that was at this time seen as part of the American success was their massive scale companies, these huge corporations type thing. And it's quite interesting that they're essentially creating these mega companies out of smaller ones. In fact, in the book America Conquers Britain, which was written in 1930, the author of that, L. Denny, basically says scale and centralized control of these corporations had an advantage over all the itty-bitty companies, if that makes any sense. So this is a kind of corporatism that we're seeing enacted. Whether it was like forced by the American government or not, you'd have to read more on, but that is essentially what is happening here. In fact, the lack of central controls is one of the things that this American guy, L. Denny, argues caused the long-term decline or loss of advantage of British industry against American industry. So make of that what you will. I think they call it Fordism in a lot of books. But anyway, let's carry on.
Yeah, I was going to say that's Fordism that you described.
In the process, thousands of workers were put on the dole. But journalists and television commentators supported this wave of sackings. They accepted Jim Slater's line. These were necessary casualties in a war to make Britain great again.
Is this just then one of the facts of life of the present situation, that as British industry gears itself up to meet world competition, some of these people have just got to go to the war?
I think that is true. I think it's an analogy, really, of there are a certain number of people in a boat, like 100 people, and the boat's going to sink unless 2 or 3 of them volunteer to jump off the edge.
Like the way you call it, volunteer.
Well, they might be draw lots for it.
I thought it was credible.
Just a quick thing, like that is one of millions of examples of capitalists being the worst defenders or the worst advocates of capitalism. Because usually most capitalists have not studied, why capitalism is better than socialism or whatever. They have no arguments for it, and they just agree with this stuff of it. It's brutal, it's vulgar, it's vicious. It's like, it's the weak go to the wall and stuff. So they always agree with the worst interpretation of it.
Okay, what would be a better way of putting it? I'm trying to think of.
Capitalism is not all about competition. It's not all about like putting people out of business. It's like largely about cooperation. Obviously, that is what a company is, and obviously, companies far more than you compete against those selling exactly the same products and services. But with all the others, all the ones that are your suppliers or who you're supplying to, you're cooperating with them as well. So it is a massive lattice of cooperation. You compete for the same customers in the same products. The rest of the picture is cooperation. And it's because of capitalism that we have the modern world, right? It's like, I understand there's bad things about the modern world as well, but it's the reason why we're not living in complete savagery. It's what raised us above, barbarism in material terms, right? Not in terms of our values, but I can't remember what the question was. Sorry.
Essentially the point they're trying to make is that if a company's making a loss, and it's because there are too many people employed, or they're going to have to make cuts somewhere. A few people are going to have to have the chop. If the company's
rather than the owner basically paying them to lose him money, So there's a loser either way. But in socialism, everyone's a loser. So it's a case of imperfect versus imperfect. Which one's better?
And I think I bought the Slater story, which was that he had at least the gift to wake up boring companies, of which there always are plenty, and there were plenty then. Now I think that I think we swallowed it whole. I say we. I think a lot of people in my business as financial journalists swallowed it whole.
Can I ask something about that guy? Does Curtis have him sitting in basically a derelict office? I mean, is that like, why is he sitting in that place with no furniture?
Why is he sitting the way he is as well, all like hunched in?
Yeah. I think it's one of the great parts of Curtis's stylization that, one of the things, if we get on to talking about it, another point about his sort of influences, he's very much about, taking documentary and sort of filtering it through things like genre film, and especially things like, horror films or suspense films or like heist films, which you see in some of the later stuff. And he likes the kind of haunted atmospheres that he gets from these sort of, derelict buildings, with people sort of crouched amidst the kind of ruins, of this unfolding disaster.
I mean, last week he put the guy across the road, so the cars would come in between the camera and him. This week he's like, right, we're going to put you in this derelict office, and we're going to give you a tiny little chair to sit in, even though you're a larger gentleman. It's kind of, I mean, these must be deliberate choices by him.
Yeah, I believe they are.
Oh shit. Oh no. Oh, bugger, where were we?
Okay.
Here.
About there.
Was it here?
A bit more. Let's see.
I think a bit further on, wasn't it?
Yeah. The next time that guy comes up, I think.
Yeah. There he is. Okay.
Then. Now I think that I think we swallowed it whole. I say we. I think a lot of people in my business as financial journalists swallowed it whole. I began to realize that I and other people in the financial press were willing dupes. I'm labouring this. It's a bit on my conscience.
In fact, there was very little evidence that any of the companies that Slater took over had become more productive. Almost all the increase in profits he reported came from the stripping out and selling off of assets. Slater and the other
I think that is true. I think he's got it right there. Like, he's not necessarily making these companies any more productive whatsoever. It's just taking the productive bits and selling off the rest, or dissolving the rest. That's all it is.
Well, and so the quote unquote profits are just the sales proceeds of the asset stripping, essentially.
Yeah, and he's not necessarily improving. He may be improving the management. I don't know, but it's mostly just about making him and his investors quick money, isn't it?
And for a bit of context, Slater's net worth was about £20 million at that time, which is about £200 million in today's money.
I like this desk. I like it. Let's carry on.
It's a similar feel to the film last week, with all the kind of abandoned radio stations and government buildings after all these military coups, and now you've got all these abandoned commercial spaces after these corporate coups.
Were not the saviours of industry they pretended to be.
They like to pretend that they went in as some sort of consulting group and restructured industry. They didn't. They ripped it apart and sold off the assets and destroyed industry. They weren't interested in the regeneration of Britain. They were interested in making as much money as they could, by any means. Slater was beginning a tremendous process of change, which has ended with the destruction of large parts of British industry. Because the assets of industry were taken, and perhaps rightly so, but were taken and were used for other purposes.
I mean, in economic speak, would say reallocated to more productive ends. But that didn't happen, did it? They weren't reallocated. They were outsourced, and we just got crap imported from everywhere else. This stuff was never replaced.
We'd need to know who bought all the assets from Slater's company in order to say whether they were, what happened to them after this. Because if you're talking about like all this sort of the general economic history of Britain, since the Second World War, yes, it's crap, obviously. But in terms of people just buying assets and basically were reallocating them, that will have mixed results. Sometimes they would have gone to better owners or owners who put better use to them, put them to better use, and in some cases. I very much doubt there's many cases where he bought a company that was doing great and just destroyed it. If it was doing well and he destroyed it, it was probably because selling it in separate pieces made released more value.
I mean, let's just pretend it was a supra marginal firm, right? Just about making enough to carry on, minimal profits, but just about getting by. If he takes that over, strips it out, knocks down all the buildings, he's turned something that had productivity above zero, right? Some number bigger than zero, and he's turned it into zero, hasn't he? That's basically what's happened. So.
I mean, if he's buying businesses and just shutting them, even though they were making a profit, or I don't know what did he gain by that? I'm not sure. But maybe just like if it was going to make, $1 million over 10 years, but he could make 300 grand by selling it over, in 1 year. Maybe that's what he did. But I mean, even so, who bought these assets? Who bought the land that the buildings were knocked down on? It's too general a statement from Curtis or from that guy. It's in some cases this will have released value that wasn't being used. In some cases, not.
The wave of takeovers created by the Labour government had little or no effect on productivity. The British economy stubbornly refused to grow.
Pause one second.
But the takeovers were having a hidden...
Sorry, but like that's Curtis just talking about some aggregate productivity figure for the whole company, for the whole country. Like you can't just look at whether say productivity went from, I don't know what even the measure of it is, but say it went from 49 to 50 over this time. Sorry, no, he said it didn't. Right, say it went from 49 to 48 over this time. You can't say that. I mean, that's the whole economy. That's the whole British. That's one measure, one state measure of the whole British economy. You can't say whether a decline or an increase was caused by one company, Slater Walker. There's no way you just cannot tell that positively or negatively. That's just poor reasoning. But this is what happens, and Keynes especially, and Keynesians encourage this aggregate statistical thinking. Obviously, you see that in action today when you literally get Paul Krugman telling you, no, you're not getting poorer because the stats say you're not. It's like, no, but I am.
But
I definitely am.
I think you can say, though, if there was a factory there and there no longer is a factory there, productivity's probably gone down.
Production has ended in that location.
No more production from that formerly productive location.
Yeah.
So you could say, like, from that point of view. Yeah, well, what has happened to it? They probably turned them into multi-story car parks or, Debenhams or whatever they built.
I do object to this aggregate thinking that I mean, I doubt Curtis has got the economic nous to understand, but just saying, the example I always think of is in when Blair's government got in, one of their first policies was to introduce a minimum wage, right? And some Tories, probably backbenchers, because I can't imagine William Hague would have the sense to say this, but essentially a minimum wage, effectively makes illegal all jobs under a certain wage, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that people raise the wages, it's they stop offering those jobs or they offer them illegally. My first job was like that. I just got paid an illegally low wage. But it was fine. It was I agreed to it. And a year or two after they passed the law, Labour said, look, the economy went up. Like the GDP went up. So all that you said about they said unemployment went down. So they said you were wrong. But you don't know that didn't cause it. That may have caused unemployment, a lot of unemployment, but something else caused even more employment. So the aggregate figure went up. There's a million things that applies to, but yeah, just speaking in terms of aggregates tells you that can actually mislead you. It's not just crude; it can actually be wrong as well.
My first job was illegal too. I was working in the bakery section of a supermarket, Gateway, Summerfield, and I got paid £2.18 an hour.
Yeah.
And I remember going in to see the manager to be like, "How come I'm only getting paid £2.18 an hour? Like, isn't this illegal?" And I remember I went in, and the manager said, "What are you on then? £1 an hour or something?" That was his opening gambit. So that was shortly before I made my big money move to McDonald's. So anyway,
I just want to remind people the words that the Labour front bench choir are singing here. While cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Great days.
Revolutionary effect on the structure of power in Britain. Both Slater and now the politicians were liquidating many of the assets of industry. They were feeding them as cash into an ever-booming stock market. In future, it would be the millions of small shareholders who would decide where that money should go. The market was now increasingly shaping the future of the economy, not the politicians. And the men who appeared for the moment...
Sorry to pause it again, but as per James Burnham, it's not quite true that the millions, quote unquote, of small investors are deciding how the capital is allocated. In many cases, actually on the ground, it will be asset managers managing that money on behalf of those people. And it is, in fact, those managers have greater control over how the capital is allocated. And this is essentially what people like BlackRock do today. You know, a lot of people's pensions, for example, are managed by BlackRock. They are allocating capital on my behalf right now. I don't know what the hell they're investing in. How the hell do I know? But and that will be the case for many of these quote unquote millions of people. So anyway, let's carry on.
To control the market were the tycoons from the Claremont Club. And the tycoons were about to be joined by a new, even more ruthless member. He too was going to use the growing power of the market to build an empire, but not in Britain, in Africa. And yet again, he was going to deceive politicians.
I have it in command from the Queen to read to you the following message from Her Majesty. As you assume the heavy responsibilities of independence, I send my good wishes for a great and noble future.
Through the 1960s, Britain gave independence to her former colonies in Africa. But what was left behind were hundreds of plantations, factories and mines, all still owned and run by the British.
Ridiculous. But of course.
They had provided the wealth of the empire. Into this world came a new type of entrepreneur. He was called Tiny Rowland, and he ran a small mining company called Lonhro. Rowland was convinced there was a fortune to be made in independent Africa, and he was going to do it by taking over Britain's old colonial industries. And what's more, the new African leaders would help him do it.
At the time, all the established companies in Africa were pulling out because of the political situation and other problems there, and he just moved in and brought them up for a song, virtually. I mean, when Rowland took over Lonhro, it was a very sleepy little company, but within 2 or 3 years of Rowland appearing on the scene, it escalated beyond all recognition. He was quite amazing, the deals he did.
The potential of in those days, black Africa was huge, and I wanted to become involved.
When you say potential, do you mean the potential for making money, or for diversifying your interests, for having power? In what terms do you talk about potential?
Not in terms of making money alone, or having power. That never occurred to me. The excitement, the interest which I thought I would be acquiring, the people I would be able to meet, the vast openings on the continent, these were the ones which attracted me most of all.
The takeover that made Roland...
Just interesting there that his PR stories there it's not about money. That's terribly vulgar. It's about the excitement and the adventure and the interest. It's still the aristocratic projection.
I was going to say, that's quite upper class, isn't it?
Yeah, interesting.
And powerful in Africa and in Britain came in 1968. He used ruthless methods to get hold of the richest gold mine in the world, the Ashanti gold mine in northern Ghana. It had been run by a British company for over 80 years, and the chairman was a famous war hero, General Edward Spears.
We're back on the Gold Coast tourist, remember?
I want to see the guy doing backwards somersaults.
He lived in colonial splendour at the centre of the mine. He had his Rolls-Royce shipped out, and every week fresh grouse was flown from London. To the African miners, he was their ruler.
Now, this group of pictures here, I think, are of the more of the mine workers. This man has obviously just come off shift. And I rather think this was one of the mine policemen. And then the two dear old men up here who worked more distantly for the mines, I think. I think that these pictures really represent the people over whom Spears had great control and was more or less a patriarch. And I think they show that the Ashanti were very fine people who Spears respected tremendously, and equally they respected him.
Pause a second.
God.
This guy, General Spears, I just realised I've been actually writing about him recently. It's the same guy. He's known as Louis Spears in some books, but David Irving includes him in his book Churchill's War. He was one of the key members of the Focus.
Oh, was he?
Yeah,
oh,
I think
right.
he was part English, part French. So he was big into this sort of the Entente and the balance of power idea and standing with France. And that's probably his involvement. But he was also corrupt. He was getting a yearly payoff from the Czech government all through the 30s. And he was director on one of their major industrial firms that was also large, controlled by the Rothschilds.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Very interesting. Okay. Yeah, I wonder, though, if he ran that mine better than they run it today. I really do wonder about that, but let's carry on.
There was no way Roland could buy Ashanti outright. He couldn't raise enough money. So secretly he flew to Ghana to see the country's new rulers. He offered them a deal. Instead of being exploited by the old colonials like General Spears, he would run the mine in partnership with them. All they had to do was to cancel Spears's lease on the mine and give it instead to him. He also allegedly gave them money. They agreed. When the news that the lease was being terminated was leaked to the London Stock Exchange, the price of Ashanti's shares crashed, and Roland moved in and bought the company for a song.
Very clever indeed.
Tiny Roland really squared the Ghana government so that Spears couldn't resist the takeover bid, and eventually felt it was in the best interest of his shareholders to accept Tiny Roland's offer. The impression I got was that he was extremely able and very ruthless tycoon, really.
Roland now flew round Africa in his private jet, doing similar deals and building a vast industrial empire for himself. To the African politicians, he presented himself as a new partner, building with them a modern industrial Africa. But like Slater and the other takeover men, he was deceiving them. Roland was stripping as much of the profits out of the companies as he could and feeding it back into the London stock market. In turn, his share price went up and he could do more takeovers. It was growth by acquisition, not by investment.
country was really being cheated. It's millions of dollars.
And where did that money go?
It definitely didn't come to Zambia. It went to London.
To London?
Yes.
What's your reaction about that?
I'm furious.
Who do you hold responsible for that?
All those people who perpetrated such an empire and such a trail of betrayal.
Betrayal?
Yes, for development program of the country.
Tiny Rowland says he loves Africa.
Because Africa has enriched him, so he would love it. He definitely loves it because it has enriched him. The relationship between Tiny Rowland and African presidents is not really sincere and honest. It's the relationship between the rider and the horse. It's the rider who benefits. I don't think the horse benefited at all.
Rowland just wanted power. He just wanted to control events and people, and I think money as well, of course. You can't do either of those without the third of those. But he just wanted complete power over his domain. He would lie. He would put one person against another. He would do anything to achieve his aim.
Tiny Rowland now became a close friend of Jim Slater and the other takeover tycoons.
God, all of them together. My gosh.
They dined together at the Claremont and sold each other companies. All of these new tycoons were making fortunes by tearing up an old system of industrial power that had dominated Britain and its empire for over 100 years. But they were about to become even richer and even more powerful. And yet again, it was to happen by accident.
See, Horace, I think all of this is bad because there's no productive element here. Like, the good bit of capitalism is the gains it gives you. These guys are just fucking wrecking everything.
I think all we really disagree on is just I'm more strongly contemptuous of what came before, of what they overthrew. That's all. I don't like these guys at all. And I think Tiny Rowland was corrupt. Jim Slater was a failure. James Goldsmith I got a bit more sympathy for because he became the referendum party guy. But yeah, no, these guys are beasts. I'm sure some of them are sociopaths as well.
That old colonel running that gold mine, for example, at least like it was a mine. They were bringing gold out of the ground, and he was giving those people that you saw on the walls jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this Tiny Rowland fella has he just has no interest at all in actually running the enterprise, does he?
No, he looks worse and worse through the rest of this series as well.
Mm. I think the whole thing in microcosm is very much like these stories about these London clubs being taken over recently by, kind of woke cadres of management and, expanding their membership, shall we say. And, you sort of have contempt for them in the same way Horace is talking about for letting go of what they had. Being so complacent.
AA, who would you rather have a game of wild, buccaneering poker with, James Goldsmith or Charlotte Proudman?
Oh, I think I think I'd probably have a better chance of beating the woman, wouldn't I? Yeah, I'll go with Proudman. I'd probably lose to both of them, to be fair.
As the politicians desperately tried one more time to make Britain's ailing economy grow.
The Queen has asked me to form the next government, and I am indeed proud to accept. To govern is to serve. This government will be at the service of all the people, the whole nation.
In 1970, the Conservatives were returned to power, led by Edward Heath. Heath presented himself as a new kind of politician. He rejected the Keynesian idea that governments could control the economy. He would give up government intervention in industry and let the lame duck...
Is it just me, or does Heath look like a spitting image puppet? He's got the same, already looks like he's made out of that latex rubber.
Politicians did back then.
It's weird, isn't it?
Go to the wall. It was the Thatcherite philosophy, 10 years ahead of its time. But the consequences were terrifying. Within months, scores of factories closed and unemployment soared. And in 1971, Rolls-Royce, Britain's most famous company, declared it was bankrupt. Heath decided the experiment had failed. The government would reassert control over the economy.
We are not prepared to tolerate the human waste and suffering that accompany persistent unemployment. We stand by those words today. The measures we have taken this year are proof of our determination to expand the economy, but to do so on sound foundations and to bring down the level of unemployment.
Heath now went to the other extreme. He poured money into the economy. He increased government spending and relaxed borrowing. It was called the Dash for Growth.
Yes, Jim, over.
55,000 crude, you're 25, please, over.
I confirm you want to buy 55,000 crude.
But much of the money went into creating a stock market bubble that did nothing to make industry more efficient. Above all, it was invested in the new companies of the takeover men. And Jim Slater's share price soared to astounding heights.
At the moment.
Go on.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't specify like what did the Tories, did the government? I mean, it implies that they put loads of money into the economy. What does that mean? Does that just mean loads of money printing? Does that mean it doesn't specify? But obviously, like, who gets the money first? That's always the question, right? If the money is just basically dumped onto the stock exchange in some way, then yeah, it's going to send up stock prices wildly. The other thing I'm sorry.
Yeah, if there's a credit expansion, it would go on risky investments as per Mises.
Yeah, and normally just anything, especially as central banks tend to signal that they're trying to drive up asset prices. That's a normal thing for them to say now, right? That means that generally money just goes to the things that are already expensive and makes them more expensive, puts them further out of the reach of the little people, which will be stocks, commodities, luxury items, houses.
Mm-hmm.
It just pumps up the already rich. That's probably always been the way. I just wanted to pick up on something else for a minute ago as well. Just for those who don't know what the post-war consensus was, right? So you mentioned Heath was talking about unemployment, right? There's three things. GDP, you wanted it to go up, but you could accept some stagnation. Inflation, they basically accepted high inflation through a lot of the 50s, 60s, 70s. But unemployment, you would not. The consensus was you don't let unemployment go up. That has to stay in the low lower than 500,000 at all times. So when unemployment went up, Heath, who was trying to sort of break out of the consensus a bit, suddenly just snapped back into it. That's how it worked until about 10 years later.
He panicked basically. And how did they keep people employed? Was it literally just like, okay, now your job is dig a ditch and fill it back in again? Classic Keynesian stuff, or
I don't know if they did much of that. I think they probably, that was done in Hitler's Germany. That was done in New Deal America, and probably in Britain in the 30s. But I don't think in the post-war time. I don't think they did make work schemes. I think it was basically just monetary stimulus. It must have been like loosening credit conditions was one thing. Or money printing. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, it's monetary. And it's basically just in the hope that the money floods out and makes investment more attractive, which leads to higher employment. So goes the theory.
It was a pretty heady time, really. The stock market always went up. I know stories of people going into the old stock market where you walked onto the floor and they saw shares like Slater Walker and so on there and bought for themselves, not for their clients, some shares, went to the loo and come back and they'd sort of made about 25% on their money. And so they sold them again and made profits. Well, the trouble is, that's not reality. No company can move in value like that. So you're actually getting a bubble.
Well, then if you bought the shares, they were bound to go up. So you didn't do anything, you just bought the shares and they went up. For some of these people, some of the great names. And that expectation allows them to use the share, increase share price, allows them to use the share to go and buy something. Because shares are nothing more than sort of supercharged pounds, really. You can use them to buy other companies.
Pause a second.
Which they did.
Yeah, so this guy might be a financial journalist, or maybe like a top publication, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. What do you mean the supercharged pounds? What are you talking about? But what those guys are saying a second ago as well, like you could just buy anything and just make 25% in like 20 minutes. Nonsense. But also, to the extent that, I mean, they're exaggerating, but to the extent that that was true, that can only last for, a brief, insane period. And that is the effect of government just dumping money into the economy. You just have a speculative mania. And obviously, those who think that all you've got to do is buy something to make a profit, those people tend to just get wrecked, right? They buy at the top. They hear about the hysteria as it's peaking. They buy the top. They lose all their money. And obviously the people who were buying on the way up get to sell to them. But it's that's not like a summary of the economy. That's a moment. It's a craze caused by a sudden injection of money.
I mean, it seems like this particular company, the Slater company, was one of those that experienced this bubble growth at this time.
Which they did. And you can use them to raise more money in the stock market.
Using the power of his extraordinary share price, Jim Slater now became the dominant force in the City of London. He set up his own banking operation and a network of satellite companies, each of which set about asset stripping British industry. He gave thousands of pounds to the Tory party, while his former partner, Peter Walker, became a cabinet minister. Jim Slater was now all-powerful.
I did become a bit arrogant, I think, about what I was doing, the business side, I would say. Probably still am.
What do you mean?
Well, I think if you're reading in the press things like this, the master has just done this, and, how wonderful it all is, and how clever it is, and all that. You keep reading it. In the end, you sort of start to believe it. You begin to feel you're walking on water a bit. It was thin ice, in fact.
How dangerous was that for you?
It's not desirable, is it? It's going to end up in some sort of problem.
Jim Slater became a partner of the politicians. Ted Heath invited him to become an unofficial advisor to the government. And the whiz kids who ran his satellite companies portrayed themselves as new kinds of industrialists. They were working with government to reconstruct and modernise Britain.
Well, I think we're very much the sort of company that has evolved as part of Ted Heath's government, which is pretty radical.
I'm just trying to get my head around something, because as this documentary has explained it so far, these guys have made money exclusively from buying up companies and selling off their assets. And now they're advising the government. I mean, did anybody not think, hold on a second, okay, these guys have made a few quick bucks doing this over the past few years, but what have they made? What have they contributed to the economy? What have they, I mean, I don't understand that they're being taken into power now.
Isn't this like peak managerialism? It's like the politicians saying, we're managers, we want good management, but these guys have proved themselves to be better managers, so let's hire them and gain from their wisdom. Isn't that what it is? It's wrong, it's stupid, but isn't that what the politicians think?
They haven't even managed anything.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's just superficial idiocy on the part of the politicians, and these guys are probably just bullshitting to them as well. Do you ever, the thick of it? The character of Julius Nicholson.
Yeah.
I think he was supposed to be, he's referred to as like a business guru brought in because he'll apply his management techniques, his market rigor to all that stuff. That was big in the Blair time, right? Market discipline. Oh well, Thatcher as well. Market discipline for the public sector. But it's they just look at a crude view of their results, or just the guy's CV, which is just full of boasts. These guys were spivs. These guys, what they did collapsed in flames in the end. So they weren't good advisors. But the politicians are easily impressed, or they just think there's some formula. It's nonsense.
This approach is trying new methods, is trying new ways of doing things, and for the most part has been very successful. I think, in fact, this is actually the solution to the British problem, if you like. Throughout the UK, you could release half the assets, half the work staff of just about every company, And you would suddenly, of course, double your gross national product.
So make half the country unemployed
And line go up.
increase the GNP. Is that what they're saying?
Mm-hmm.
The takeover tycoons had finally supplanted the old captains of industry. They had forged a new partnership with politicians. But what few people realized was that their success was based on a facade. They were doing nothing to reconstruct British industry. They were merely profiting from its decline. But drunk on this moment of power, they portrayed themselves as the inheritors of the great industrialists of Britain's past.
If you look back to the great days of British industry, the days when we controlled 23% of the world's trade as opposed to about 9% now, when all these great legendary companies were founded, they were all founded, without exception, by capitalists, industrialists, financiers, whatever you want to call them, with a face. Now, all these men who founded these companies were tough, ruthless, ambitious, and not necessarily likable men.
They also forced the captains of industry to bow down to them. Tiny Rowland placed on his board the old establishment figures from each company he bought up. He wanted to display them as trophies.
Drove him? Oh, partly money thing, partly to beat the likes of us, I think. You know, he didn't really like us much. And by us, I mean the establishment. If you look at his most extraordinary thing, the odd thing is he liked Etonians, and he had umpteen Etonians on his board, stiff with them. I can't think why, but he did. But he wanted to sort of, I don't know, beat us, I suppose. I mean, at our own game or somebody's game.
Well, he was just buying them. He was just using them. And it's amazing how these people would react to a motor car or a trip abroad or a night out or a flat or something. I was amazed because I would have thought they'd be above that sort of thing. They were all sort of blue-blooded, top-notch people, and yet they would still want a free ride.
Why does everybody call me Big Ed? Why do they take the mickey out of me? Everywhere I go they call me Big Ed. It isn't very nice, you must agree. I don't know how I got the name of Big Ed. It's a puzzle that I never could define. 'Cause nearly all the folks who call me Big Ed have got bigger heads than mine.
But the tycoons' brief moment of power was about to be destroyed. By 1973, it was clear that Heath's dash for growth had failed.
Classic Curtis.
But this was a fantasy.
It had created rampant inflation, and when the government tried to hold down wages, it led to violent strikes. The politicians privately believed they were losing control of the country.
It seemed to me the government had lost control and wanted to give in but didn't know how to give in, and that it was the proof of something, an idea which was becoming quite prevalent among some of us, that whatever the government did, the trade union power was too strong to be effectively countered. That sense of pell-mell of things crowding in, overpowering even a prime minister who was disciplined and determined to do his best, the crowd of events became too great.
In one last attempt to control the economy, Heath decided to slam the brakes on. he announced an immediate freeze on wages, prices, and profits. The idea that profits would be restricted.
Is that Heath himself?
Hmm.
Wow, he could do conducting, could he?
Conductor and a yachtsman, I think, wasn't he?
Wow. Impressive.
Panicked the stock market, and the bubble finally burst. Share prices began to slide. This was a disaster for the tycoons, because their share price was their only source of power. Goldsmith immediately sold off practically all his companies, as did Jim Slater, but he found it more difficult.
Unfortunately, we were in a lot of our liabilities, on property in particular, were difficult to get out of. So although I could see it coming, I was selling off companies left, right and centre. But in the end, I was stuck, if I want a better word.
Tiny Rowland was also stuck. Try as he could, he found it impossible to siphon enough profit out of his African companies to support his share price. So he created fake profits.
The profits of Lonrho were, of course, what Rowland did was, with all the companies, all these 300 companies, where they traded with each other, and a lot of them did a lot of intercompany trading, he just added all the sales figures together and consolidated them in one set of accounts, which were produced in London for the Stock Exchange, of course.
Well, we've just had the quarterly figures of Lonrho, which is one of our mining companies, and the figures are entirely in line with our expectations. They've made no announcement about nothing at all. No.
It looks like a very encouraging report. Call them better on it. Call them 71.3. 71.3. Yeah.
Good news every time. Wonderful news.
Is that illegal now or then? Or like, let's say you own 300 companies, you get them all to buy from each other, so it looks like they're making a profit. Is it illegal?
Well, that would be a subtraction from the buying firm. You couldn't falsify a business, but I think he was just like entering profit, just entering revenues that hadn't really happened. I think so. Yeah, that's just fraud. Yeah, that's just
bigger profits, bigger turnover, and so on.
It wasn't true.
On the whole, no, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. It was false reporting.
At this point, the establishment decided to turn and fight. The old directors Rowland had placed on his board as trophies were told by the accountants about the false profits. They also discovered that Rowland had made secret payments to an ex-Tory minister called Duncan Sandys. Rowland had bribed him to become chairman and make Lonrho look respectable. To the old directors, this was corrupt, and they voted to sack Tiny Rowland as chief executive.
Go on.
I don't know if they mentioned this, but Duncan Sandys was, I believe, the nephew of Winston Churchill. He's also, with Churchill, one of the very early leaders of the European Union movement in the 40s.
Do you think it was just known among people? Oh well, that family, they can easily be bought off. You know, just like Winston, he can be bought off too.
That would make sense.
They waited for an opportunity when Mr. Rowland was out of the country, traveling the Africa and the Gulf states, and it was only.
This guy's literally like a character from a
great.
movie.
This is one of the bits of Curtis's genius. I think he picks these people who almost come out of it like a seedy spy novel or a sort of crime noir, and you never really see them again. But they say more with just a little cameo than a dozen of these straight interviews in terms of the sort of mood.
Yeah.
When I overheard a telephone conversation in the suite, Mr. Rowland was out having a meeting between a young lawyer, and some people in London, that I thought something was awfully wrong. And upon Mr. Rowland's return, I told him that I had a feeling something was going to happen in London.
Rowland arrived back to find there had been a boardroom coup. He was no longer in control of his company. The Lonhro affair also became a political scandal. Rowland came to symbolise the hidden corruption and fakery of the takeover tycoons. The politicians took their anger out on Rowland as the symbol of a group of sleazy nouveau riche businessmen who had tricked them. In Parliament, Edward Heath called him the unpleasant and unacceptable face of capitalism.
We have already set in hand an inquiry into the Lonhro Company. Where abuses become apparent, we shall introduce reform. We shall bring forward a new Companies Bill in the next session of Parliament. Where unfairnesses exist in our society, we shall do our utmost to correct them.
Do you regard anything of what has happened as unacceptable?
In what particular way?
Anything that has been brought to light as a result of the Lonhro affair, do you find any of that in any way the unacceptable face of capitalism?
I can't judge, because this is now escalated into a political matter, and I know so little about politics here that I just can't comment.
Butter wouldn't melt. Amazing.
Can I just
little
say
about politics?
Can I just say though, Heath, takes these guys in, brings them all on as advisors and so on, and then then he can scapegoat them afterwards. That is, what you were saying earlier on about power, Horace. Like the government can always do that. Can always kind of throw someone under the bus and wash their hands of them and try to make political hay with it, even though they were basically in bed with these guys.
It should be the other way round. Like the corporate raider guys should be in the government. People like Heath should be running companies. I think that would work out better.
Are you sure you want that guy? That guy we just saw running as a
No, I haven't. I'm sorry, I haven't thought it through at all. I was scratching the last remark.
But Rowland decided to fight. He was convinced he still had one group of supporters left. They were the thousands of small shareholders. He summoned an EGM, an extraordinary general meeting, to ask the shareholders to vote for his reinstatement. He had made them rich. Now they must come and save him.
My God, the populist illusion. I can't believe it.
We walked in by the back door and we sat in the sort of front row. When I say the front row, where the board would be, I mean the sort of... And then it started. And they all, I can't remember what resolutions were put, obviously. And they all voted for Tiny, as simple as that.
Why did they vote for Tiny?
Why? Well, I told you already, he made them a lot of money. And he was making them a lot of money. And they were all little men, or mostly, and so they were.
What do you mean, little man?
The little chap who has 1,000 shares or something, or maybe 2,000, and goes to an EGM. And, that's big stuff for him.
After the meeting...
I was going to say, if Paul Whitehouse didn't get the character of Rolly Birkin from him, he's well into his fifth scotch there, and his tie's all over the place.
Base comment as well, the little man. He does. I mean, Curtis does have this way of finding these guys who are larger than life characters. I mean, there's this dude, that guy, and then the guy on the tiny chair earlier on in the office. Like, these are memorable characters, aren't they?
All of the directors that opposed him seemed to have suddenly disappeared and were never heard of again in any context. Not in Lonhro.
Pause a second. Does anybody recognise this guy's accent? I don't know, where is he African?
I don't know. I feel like I've seen him in a mafia movie or something. I just don't know where he's from.
Right.
Do you recognise his accent?
I'm thinking maybe like Namibia or something, or like Zimbabwe or something.
Oh, you think he's an African? Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
He won. He won big. Yes, they disappeared from the stage as if shut down one by one, like a turkey shoot.
I knew it was going to happen. I was thinking, where would I go and have tea? Simple as that.
Like a flash of lightning on a dark night, Rowland's victory showed where power had now shifted in Britain. The old captains of industry and the politicians had reunited to try and defeat him and everything that he represented. But Rowland had summoned up the power of the stock market and won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, for an event was about to occur thousands of miles away that would show that no one controlled the market. In 1973, the Arab-Israeli War broke out. One of the consequences was that the Arabs put up the price of oil by 400%. The effect on the Western economies was disastrous. In Britain, the stock market was pushed over the edge into a catastrophic crash. It finally made the politicians realize they had no control over the economy.
As Prime Minister, I want to speak to you simply and plainly about the grave emergency now facing our country.
We are fucked.
In the House of Commons this afternoon, I announced more severe restrictions on the use of electricity. We are limiting the use of electricity by almost all factories, shops and offices to 3 days a week. Jobs will be in danger and take-home pay will be less. We shall have to postpone some of the hopes and aims we have set ourselves for expansion and for our standard of living. We shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war.
Do you know what's weird is that Sunak gave a speech like that last week and everybody just rolled their eyes. Whereas when he said it, I was like, yeah, I believe him. But
isn't it uncanny as well? You know, oil prices going up, talk of power outages.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, isn't it?
Weird.
It does feel like something is around the corner at the minute. But anyway, we will see.
It was a steeper fall than there had been in this country at the great crash of 1929-31. That was obviously going to wipe out a lot of financiers, speculators, punters, people who'd bought property on borrowed money, people who bought anything on borrowed money. But it was more than that. The whole post-war idea that if you got into trouble you could always print a bit more money and it would get you out and get everybody steaming along.
Wonder what happened to that idea, because it feels like it's back in a pretty big way, doesn't it?
Exactly.
That was what collapsed. And with it, the idea that you could manage and manipulate the economy in such a way as to be sure that it always did go steaming along.
As a result of the crash, Jim Slater went bankrupt. He retired to write children's books. Goldsmith and Rowland both survived the crash, and they left the country. Rowland returned to Africa, and Goldsmith went to America. But both swore they would return and have their revenge on the British establishment.
I mean, wasn't it Goldsmith who was shouting out, out, out at Portillo in 97?
David Mellor. It was David Mellor. He was
it was
shouting
David
out.
Mellor, was it?
Yeah, yeah.
Mellor. That was it, yeah.
Mellor then I think he won. Oh no, sorry, Mellor lost the seat. So UKIP, referendum party. Goldsmith got like some pathetic amount of votes. Mellor also lost the seat, and then he dedicated his losing speech to having a go at James Goldsmith and just ignored the fact that Labour had just taken over the country.
Yeah. You can bugger off back to your hacienda, I think was the word, wasn't it?
That's it, yeah.
I actually served David Mellor once when I was a waiter, working at Kempton Racecourse, I think it was. It's the only
Natural
shift.
coughing motion.
Yeah, well, I was usually on the pork stand with my natural carving motion. Well remembered, Simon. But on this one occasion, it was Arab racing. And there was special guests from Saudi Arabia coming in on helicopters. And for some reason, David Mellor was with them. So it was a big group of Arabs, and David Mellor was there. And he was, I have to say, an incredibly boorish fellow. And he did not leave a very good impression on me at all. But,
I find, even though I'm a curious person, but I find myself not wanting to know what the fuck he was doing on a plane with a load of Arabs. Whatever it was, just don't tell me.
I still don't know. I just kind of, we had to wear white kid gloves. And it was very weird because we had to bring out, each of us had one plate, and we had to come out in one formation and give the one person and then file back out again. Very, very odd. But that was the only time I ever worked as a waiter. So there we are.
It's curious how you couldn't detect the natural class in someone like David Mellor, famed for shagging Antonio de Sancha on his ministerial desk in a Chelsea kit.
He was incredibly boorish, incredibly.
Still is.
So there we are.
In Berkeley Square, I know 'cause I was there.
Well, I do not have a high opinion of the asset strippers. So there we go. They did not fill me with much love for them. And I don't know. I mean, it really does seem like the country was buggered in so many different ways at this point. In fact, I mean, the more I've read about 20th century British history, it's a wonder how anything works at all anymore. I mean,
I may sound a little pious saying this, but I think that is a testament to the quality of ordinary British people. We've been badly run, but ordinary people continue. Even now, ordinary people continue to queue and be polite and cooperate with each other. And it's at one moment it tells two stories: how brilliant British people are in general, and how awful the people in charge are. That all this intelligence and all this hard work and goodwill and good cooperation and stuff doesn't, we're still getting poorer. That's how badly we're being run.
I reckon there's an argument to say that Britain has been the worst run country since World War II in the world. Well, or in the Western world at the very least. I mean, it's been such a fucking shit show.
There's a great quote from Edmund Burke I always remember from Reflections on the French Revolution, where he says the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has exceeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. And that's pretty much the story of the episode. Naive toffs versus mathematician accountants.
When did Burke say that?
Reflections on the French Revolution.
1892, 1792 or something. Just showing my knowledge there. A couple of years after the overthrow of the monarch, but hadn't yet executed them, I think. I read that book.
Boggles the mind. I mean, we mentioned Carlyle at the start of the episode. I mean, he was saying things were buggered in the 1850s. Here we are in 2024, and it's been like literally 150 years of shit show.
Did I hear you right in saying that Disraeli was a fan of Carlyle?
Well, Disraeli was a fan of Carlyle, and famously, Carlyle offered Carlyle a knighthood, which Carlyle turned down because, of course, Carlyle was a massive anti-Semite.
That's all right. No, Disraeli was a Christian, though, so that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, Carlyle not only was not a fan of Disraeli, who he had critical remarks of, he was not a fan of Lord Rothschild either. And Rothschild at one point wanted Carlyle to back his bid to become to become an MP or a Lord or something. And I'm trying to remember exactly what Carlyle said because it's a classic quote.
This was for Jews to be able to become MPs and not make a Christian oath, wasn't it?
Yes.
It's the Commons. It's not. I don't think it's Lord Rothschild yet. It's a bit earlier than that.
And I'm trying to remember the exact quote of Carlyle, but it's basically like his people have no business. He said. How could a Jew try to become a senator or even a citizen of any country except his own wretched Palestine? Said Carlyle in 1948. And I remember reading before that he had been very rude about Disraeli on these grounds as well, made comments about him eating bacon and stuff like this. And when he was offered the knighthood, which he felt compelled to turn down, apparently he went on a massive guilt trip that he had been like so rude about Disraeli and stuff. And apparently he had he didn't apologize, but he had private regrets that he'd been so rude about him. But Carlyle was not a fan of the like many other people of that era, he associated them with the worst excesses of capitalism, money lending, etc., etc.
And doing capitalism in that exploitative way that forces everyone else down as well, sort of thing.
Yeah, he's got also mammon worship. He called it a lot. Carlyle did. But anyway,
obsession with maximizing your profit and so on. Didn't Carlyle also write a book on the French Revolution? I started reading.
He did, yeah. The French Revolution. Brilliant book. Brilliant book, which I would get. Unlike any other history book you'll ever read, that one.
That was like a bucking bronco. Like you have to hold on to his style. Throws you all over the place. He assumes you know everything already.
Yeah,
it's not educational. It's for the already in the know.
His technique. His technique for writing that book and researching it is very interesting as well, because what he did is he got contemporary magazine accounts, like anecdotes, stuff from people on, accounts from people who were there on the street and so on, and tried to bring you down to the street, almost like a kind of fly on the wall documentary, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to write a very different type of history. He called normal history dry as dust history.
It's really lively. Of what I've read of that book, I couldn't keep up. I didn't quite know what he was referring to all the time, so I'll go back to it at some point. But
yeah, you need Wikipedia open or a set of footnotes or whatever to explain, all the names and the faces, because he doesn't really explain anything.
No.
Coney says, Enya. So we're going to do some super chats. Coney says, Enya is a highbrow wood. I posted on Orinoco Flow on Twitter last night, and so he's giving Enya props. Tiger Right. I always think that Enya is the sort of person who'd go to a yoga retreat or be spiritual or whatever, So much like my wife is like that these days as well. Tiger Rider says, unrelated, but what do you make of Sunak's announcement? Does it raise an eyebrow that the system wants Labour in so much? Do they realise this will destroy the kayfabe? Do they want to destroy the kayfabe? Well, I thought about this a bit, and I actually think that one of the possible reasons for doing it is to catch all the other parties on the hop. Not so much Labour, who are going to become the government, but all of the other ones like Heritage and that new party that Dominic Cummings and Goodwin wanted to set up, and Reform. By jumping the gun, the Tories have their machine in place already, good to go. Whereas all of those other parties, how many seats are there? 650? How the hell are they going to find 650 people in 6 weeks?
I think there's only two parties who do. It's Labour and the Tories. I think they're the only ones who stand in every seat in the UK, I think.
So, yeah, but what I'm saying is that if the election was held next year or after November or whatever, there's that much more time to scramble together the people to to fill to be candidates and to actually campaign.
Mhm.
None of the other parties are going to be able to do that now. So it kind of minimizes the threat of being flanked from the right.
Yeah.
There was a tweet I saw earlier saying, Reform were only ready in sort of 400 seats or something. And a lot of those candidates will be a complete joke who haven't even been vetted or anything. So,
TK says, Mr. AA, congratulations on your appointment to the position of President of Iran. You can finally get your conversation with your idol, Tony. Will you stream from your new office? I have not been appointed the President of Iran, unfortunately. You know, I've got some ideas of how to run places, but I have not been appointed. In fact, his funeral was today. And from what I could see, quite a lot of people were there as well. Blue Wizrobe says, Rishi, you're a boy. Make a big noise keeping in the street. Oh, sorry, I've just realized what he's doing. Rishi, you're a boy making a big noise speaking in the street. Gonna be a big man someday. You got spunk on your face, you big disgrace. Waving a real rainbow flag all over the place. Singing 0, 0 seats.
sorry, the spunk on your face, but that's metaphorical, right?
I mean, I guess they're talking about the fact that he made the announcement in the rain. Earlier on, he was soaked.
That is a different fluid. I'll just be clear about that.
It reminded me a little bit of, do you remember Steve McLaren, the Wally with the Brawley? Kind of had that vibe about it.
Yep.
Port Film Co-op says, Sir James Goldsmith had a pretty decent redemption arc.
Up against Mellor, yeah.
And Port Film Co-op says, Horus playing the hyper-rational heel today, inviting scorn from the working man. Let them eat Chewits, he says.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually sort of not that keen on Chewit. Yeah.
Sada says, Jim Slater wrote a children's book by the title of Big Nose. He didn't subtitle it The World's Foremost Problem because I assume he identifies with Big Nose. And this is apparently true. Would you like to see Jim Slater's book, Big Nose?
Go on.
This is not being made up. There you go, look. There is Big Nose by Jim and Christopher Slater's Amazing Monster.
Well, that's a sensitive picture.
Interesting. Wonder what other Jim Slater books are available on. He's got a number of. He's actually got some non-children's books as well. Is this the same Jim Slater or a different one? Beyond the Zulu Principle?
That's his investing book, yeah.
Investment Made Easy, How to Make More of Your Money by Jim Slater. Goldenrod and the Kidnappers. What a strange dual career he had.
There's Black Rod in Parliament, isn't there? Do you reckon that's something to do with that? Gold Rod. It's like the one they only bring out once every 500 years or something.
How to Become a Millionaire Could Really Be You by Jim Slater. So he's got like a spiv line and a children's line. So there we go. Roger and Robot at the Safari Park by Jim Slater. Would you like to see that classic?
Go on.
There you go. There's Roger and there's Robot and there's Mum and Dad in the front. So they look quite dull, some of his books, but
yeah, they
do. Okay. And I think that is it, unless I've missed anything.
If he bought the publishing company that published his books, he'd have to sell off his books. Except no, he wouldn't, because there's no value. There's no value in them, so he couldn't. So he'd just go bust instead.
Brulham says, AA, read the Wikipedia entry for the book The Zulu Principle, written by Slater. Okay, The Zulu Principle. Oh, there is a Wikipedia entry. It's an investment guide written by English accountant and investment Jim Slater, first published by Orion in 1992. Slater named his approach to investment when he observed that after reading a short article on the Zulu people in the Reader's Digest, his wife was better informed on the subject than he himself was. He went on to consider that if his wife read all the books she could find on the subject of Zulus, coupled with a visit to South Africa to meet them for herself, then in a relatively short period of time, she could become one of the leading authorities on that clearly defined and narrow area of knowledge. The Zulu Principle was published in 2008 by Harriman House with a new preface from the author. Oh, right. Okay. So the idea is that you can become a world expert in super short amount of time. There's some truth to that, I reckon. Right. I've often found sometimes that simply researching a video on a topic probably puts you in like the top 95 percentile of people who know about that thing. Just because to explain it to someone else, you actually need to learn something about it. So I can imagine there's something to that. The NREAB says Curtis uses clips from the James Goldsmith interview with Charlie Rose. It is worth watching as he predicts how globalization destroys the country.
Yeah, that's the spoiler. Like, it's third or fourth episode of this. Well, there's just a little bit of that, but if you watch the whole interview, he became in that sense a nationalist. In a funny kind of way.
So there we are. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Another interesting episode. We're on to episode 3 next week. Should we get more than 7,800, which I think we'll do easily. Just remind us where we can find you and what you've got coming out recently for us.
Yeah, I'll have a new thing up on my Substack in a day or two. So check me out there. eternalhorus.substack.com. Cheers, everyone.
Simon.
At Simon__Roberts on Twitter, and on King Arthur Day with Nathan Hood and Mr. D on Saturday evening.
And I will just remind everyone, buy my courses at the Academic Agency. I'll be back on Monday for Cigar Stream, unless I find some time on the weekend to make a video that I've been meaning to make for a while, outlining my Rwanda Plan Plus. I think there's the grain of a decent idea in the Rwanda plan, but I will leave it for my video to outline exactly. But it involves the principle of Real Madrid B. Are you aware that Barcelona and Real Madrid have got B teams?
No.
Yeah, there's a Real Madrid
team as well.
There's a Real Madrid B and there's a Barcelona B. And they have a special dispensation to move players to their B team at any time they want, or vice versa. And it is on this principle that my Rwanda Plus plan will be outlined. Maybe Keir Starmer will pick it up. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Now get out.
Bye-bye.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.